Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In this segment, we're going to discuss the United States global energy politics. We're going to use two countries as case studies. No doubt other countries will come up as well. But first, of course, is Venezuela, where we know the U.S. has been pressuring the Maduro government there over a regime change plan. At least that's what the Venezuelan government itself would argue, trying to place Guaido instead of Maduro in power. We know that the U.S. sanctions have made it harder and harder for even U.S. companies to operate there. You must remember that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Chevron, a U.S. company, will possibly have to walk away from Venezuela. But at the same time, if we look at Iraq, the U.S. is trying to pressure Iraq to stop its dependence on Iranian gas and Iranian-supplied energy in favor of General Electric, again, a U.S. company, to come in and be awarded hefty contracts to help that country moving forward with its electricity needs. We can, of course, talk about other countries as well, be it Iran or others, when it comes to these energy politics in the region. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're firstly joined by Andreea Karadeli, who is an independent researcher based in Istanbul, Turkey. We're also joined by Ahmed Rushdi Abdullah, who is an advisor in the Iraqi parliament. He's also the president of the House of Iraqi Expertise Foundation. Andreea is joining us from Istanbul, and Ahmed is joining us from the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. Thank you both for joining us. Ahmed, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the U.S. pressure on Iraq to essentially walk away from Iranian energy? Will this work?
Well, we all know what happened in 2003 of invading Iraq and the consequences that happened. It all has at least energy background. And we all know also that Iraq is the fourth oil reserve in the whole world. So we know actually the Iraqi, let's say, the Iraqi energy file is so important to the U.S. as well as for the Iranian, as well as also for the Russians. So you can imagine how much important the energy file for Iraqi energy file for the whole world. On that basis, the U.S. actually made so many pressure to start some sort of a strategic relationship with Iraq, starting from 2003. And maybe it is the reasons that the insurgency happened against the Americans is that don't make the Americans get benefit from the energy of Iraq in one way or another.
And do you think it's good? Do you think it's good, Ahmed, that America should be benefiting from Iraqi energy? Because not too long ago, Donald Trump, in fact, said in 2017, to be exact, that Washington should seize Iraqi oil as repayment money for what the U.S. has done in Iraq.
Well, let's talk on facts. Iraq still depending on the some sort of American companies, oil companies. We all know that we have some sort of a relationship with ExxonMobil, even with Chevron, or let's say companies that some sort of a face of Chevron in Iraq. We all know also that the South Korean company that benefit from in Ambar, which belongs to one of the American companies also. So in a way or another, should make some sort of a strategic relationship on its energy with the U.S. and with the other countries. But the most important thing, don't make Iraq a field of conflict because of this file. This is the most important thing that the Iraqi government should, let's say, deal with.
Okay, so if you allow me, Ahmed, I wanted to put that point into Andreea. This is politics, U.S. style, isn't it? And especially Trump style, where he's using energy, be it oil, be it electricity, or otherwise, to get his way. What are your thoughts about that?
Yes, it is politics, but if we talk about Trump-style politics, that's more like managing a business than actually politics. So if we think from his perspective, energy is a good card that he can play, or a name that in order to that he would like to reach, and in order to reach, he would definitely have to follow different strategies. Those strategies are political, economic, strategies mainly. And when we look at Venezuela, both Venezuela and Iraq, we can see that when things do not work out the way they should be from the American perspective, then a political turmoil starts in the country, within the population. And in the end, everything, falls down in the right pieces for the U.S. So it is.
Andreea, if I may come in, because you mentioned the Donald Trump businessman, and many people mention that where they're talking about his policies. But I wonder, even from just a business perspective, if we can, even though we're probably not complete experts in that regard, but even from a business perspective, how is it good for American business to have Iranian oil, for example, zeroed, as well as Venezuelan oil?
Depending from which perspective you actually look at, what he needs and what he wants is to have the control over both sides. From a strategic point of view, from a business point of view, as I said, you need to know exactly what your aim is. If it is to control, then I'm not sure this is the right strategy to follow. However, if you look from the strategic perspective, look what happened last night, for example. When everything was ready, they were ready to attack, and in the last moment, President Trump said, no, we're not going to attack. What do you think is the reason behind that? I would definitely say it's an economic reason. It's the fact that from the Straits of Hormuz are the 1/3 of the oil is passing 1/3 of the oil for the whole world. Yeah. So he would definitely had a second thought about this again as a businessman. I think economic reasons rather than military or other political reasons kind of have a way bigger influence on President Trump, on his impulsivity, if you also like to say.
If we're thinking then about, for example, going back to Venezuela, if I may, Chevron walking away from Venezuela, for example, this has happened in the past in the 1970s as well. Venezuela nationalized the oil industry. How would that then work out, do you think, in that part of the world? And what kind of an effect will that then, do you think, have on U.S. policies, if any?
I think if he steps down, he would just, agree to the pressure and kind of stepping back. It's a show of weakness, whatever the perspective is, whoever talks about it, it's a show of weakness. It happened in the past. It was nationalized in the past. Nationalizing the oil industry is, on one hand, good for the country, but I'm not sure how good it is for at the international level, and for the American interest, it's definitely not the right choice. However, we have seen that the case in Venezuela, we have seen in a different way in Brazil as well, right? When we've seen in other countries in the region as well. So I think it's kind of the same pattern that is followed, but it's still too early to make speculations regarding whether he would step down or not. He would resist the pressure, continue to resist the pressure, or just step down.
And, all of these policies, and they create a lot of chaos, do they not, internationally, globally, when it comes to energy for many countries around the world. Do you think that in some ways the U.S. Continues to play with fire? And does this, do you think, even hurt U.S. interests more?
It depends where you look, like what perspective you look from. If you see the things, bearing in mind that bearing in mind the saying divide and conquer, then this might be a strategy. It might hurt the U.S. interest at some point, but at the same time, it can provide them the right ending or the expected ending. However, I would say that a chaos, and we are on the crave of chaos right now worldwide, with so many conflict zones, with what is happening now in the Middle East, with the conflict between U.S. and Iran, with a crisis in Venezuela, with ISIS spreading globally and becoming an international insurgency. All these are just a few factors in a total chaos that needs to be managed correctly at the international level. So I think that while it's hurting the U.S. interests, U.S. has should at least reconsider its strategy, its international strategy. If it's politics, it's politics. If it's business. But still, at the economical level, at the political level, strategy, military, everything needs to be reconsidered because the context, today's context, is rather different and complex.
All right, so let me try to bring Ahmed in. Ahmed, if you can hear me clearly, I wanted to go back to the Iraq example, if I may, and talk about whether you think that the Americans will win out by trying to force essentially the Iraqis to sign a deal with General Electric. It seems that may very well go ahead, but then there is competition, isn't there, with Siemens and other companies around the world. Do you think that this is healthy for Iraq, that Iraq is in this way being pressured by the U.S., by lobbyists and otherwise?
Well, let's talk frankly. The problem is that Iraq's industry, oil industry, is still not developed starting from the 70s. So you can imagine you have during the Iraqi-Iran war, we have destroyed oil industry. Then after that, we have the sanctions after invading Kuwait. And after that, in 2003, there was the invasion, the American invasion, which is also didn't manage to, let's say, help Iraq in a way or another in the oil industry. Now it's something else. Especially after Daesh, Iraq now needs the support of the international community in a way or another to help Iraq to improve its production, improve its industry. Not only that, improving the teaching methods, improving the academic level of oil industry in Iraq. In all those aspects, still the U.S. has the upper hand in the world. Still the U.S. can help us in a way or another. But it does not mean that we should depend 100% on the Americans because we learned the lesson well. It's supposed to be our government learn the lesson well. That don't ever depend on one line because we saw what's happened when the Iraqi government depended on Iran in various trials. Then Daesh came and destroyed Iraq. So in this policy, the Iraqi government now seeing things differently. But the problem is that the Prime Minister himself has no backup from the parliament. He has not actually gained a bloc to support him inside the parliament. So that's why I'm saying is that he is signing contracts with Siemens, but at the end it will be brought to the parliament, and maybe the parliament will refuse such an agreement. And let's not forget, 60% of spare parts in the oil industry is American-wide. In a way or another, it's more on General Electric, especially on electricity level. So
if I may for a moment, Ahmed, because we're talking about it, but I want to bring in the Iran factor in all of this as well, very, very directly. Do you think that Iraq should be reducing its dependence on Iranian supplies of energy, be it gas or otherwise? And do you think, and can you ever envision that sort of energy supply being completely zeroed as the Americans would want?
It's not like that. Iraq has its own gas fields. So you can imagine how much important that Iraq should make various aspects of cooperation with the others, not depending only on Iraq. And the most important thing, just like I said, is that Iraq has its own gas fields. So what ExxonMobil and the other American companies actually offering is that, okay, we can, and even General Electric, even GE, saying that we can depend on the Iraqi gas. In 2 years, we can provide you with let's say, 2/3 of what Iraq needs of electricity. So you can imagine the cooperation that can happen with GE in a way to get benefit from the Iranian influence. This is supposed to be happening by the Iraqi, it's supposed to be the policy of the Iraqi government. How to make those balances, how to get benefit from those political balances. It's not only signing contracts. It needs to managing things. It needs to maintain the relationship in a way or another. It needs to make Iraq in a way as a neutral zone in all of this harsh political environment. Especially we all know that there is a conflict in a way or another between the Americans and the Iranians, and it can be on the Iraqi soil.
Okay. So, Andreea, I'm wondering if any signs a contract with a U.S. company, an American company. We can use the example, of course, of Iran once again, not necessarily for U.S. companies, but for European companies. In fact, many deals were signed once the nuclear deal had come into existence back in 2015, I believe. But then all those companies have essentially walked away, right, when the politics didn't go their way, or when the Americans continued pressuring them and walked away from the deal themselves. Do you think that such contracts, especially by Americans, are actually used as, again, a political weapon, and that would be the case, again, in Iraq if GE or others were to sign contracts and move ahead with their activities in the country?
Yes, definitely. I actually agree pretty much with what has been said so far. And I think those kind of contracts are from the beginning starting the wrong way. I do agree with the fact that Iraq has to and should win its neutrality, and that means a very strong Iraq and a very strong political order within the country. And that would be the key towards this kind of contract that would help Iraq implement and develop its own technology in order to use its own energy resources, and kind of, it will still need Iran and the US, but it would need it less than before. So this kind of contract should be more on the side of Iraq and for the good of Iraq than for the U.S. interests, in order to ensure on long term stability in the region as well. Because that is the case with African countries as well. Even if we talk about energy or any other resources and contracts for resources in this region as well. Everything is done in the way, a foreign country comes in, takes the resources, uses, but it doesn't actually have the aim to develop the technology in the place and to teach, to help develop the.
Okay, Andreea, I'm gonna leave that as your final word, and I think it's a pertinent final word to leave it on, and that is, of course, that Iraq should do what is in Iraq's interest, and that should be, of course, the case for any country anywhere in the world, regardless of U.S. pressure and tactics vis-a-vis energy, oil, or otherwise. I'm going to say thank you to Andreea and Ahmed for joining us for this segment. We'll be back right after a break, viewers, continuing this conversation about U.S. energy politics globally. Thanks for staying with us, viewers. We continue to discuss the U.S. energy politics globally, and we're, of course, talking about the two case studies of Venezuela and Iraq more specifically. And in this segment, we're going to discuss with Cyril Widdershoven, who is the director of the Dutch consultancy Verossi, and he's joining us now from the Netherlands. He's also a defense analyst. We're also joined now by Zana Gulmohamad, who is a teaching associate at the politics department at the University of Sheffield. He's joining us now from Sheffield itself. Cyril and Zana, thank you both for joining us. Zana, I wanted to start with you and ask you about the American pressure on Iraq vis-a-vis Iranian energy supplies into the country and wanting Iraq to walk away from Iran completely. A, do you think that is practical? And B, do you think that this is more about, again, America protecting its businesses, such as General Electric?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. I would like to mention something. Iraq faces significant and dramatic problems with providing electricity. And this is one of the major challenges on Iraq's politics, welfare, economy, security, and everything. And for the last 5-6 years, every summer there have been demonstrations, and the demonstrations, they became very violent. They became so violent to the extent they stormed the government's buildings, and even they attacked the political parties' offices, including the Shia political parties' offices. Therefore, Iraq needs assistance to rebuild its electricity grid and infrastructure, whether this is from the Europe or United States or any neighboring country. This will be very helpful for Iraq to provide its electricity. However, the situation is not so simple as we see it. United States pressure and using Iranian electricity supplies. The problem is here.
If I may, Zana, I want to pick up on that point because Cyril, what stood out for me as Zana was talking, Cyril, was that if we were to contrast what's happening with Iraq, where Iraq needs investment, obviously it's quite clear for its energy needs and for it to become independent at some point in time in the near future vis-a-vis its own energy needs and vis-a-vis exporting its resources to other countries, then we can compare that with what's happening in Venezuela or even Iran, where the U.S. is doing the complete opposite and trying to zero all of those countries' energy exports completely. What do you make of such energy politics on behalf of the U.S.?
There is no real foreign energy strategy. The US is using whatever it feels like and whatever is fitting its structure regarding Iran or Iraq or Saudi or Venezuela. Keep in mind there is a strong position within the US which is called Energy for Freedom. And they are trying to entice friends and possible friends to be involved in the US shale future.
Yeah.
And they are using the idea of if countries are becoming energy independent, that will also mean they become more free. Well, in reality, there is not one single country in the world that is totally self-sufficient in its energy, including the US. So if we look at Iran and Venezuela, it's not only hurting Iran and Venezuela, it's even hurting the US itself because Iran and Venezuela are producing the kinds of crude that US refineries are needing. So with Iraq.
Okay, so Zana, I wanted to come in because if we're looking at examples of how the U.S. has acted when it comes to energy, and we can talk about, again, the Iran nuclear deal as well, which I brought up in the previous segment also, what's to say that if today the U.S. or U.S. companies were to sign a deal with Iraq to help it develop its own electricity, infrastructure, et cetera, that tomorrow, if Iraq were to make political decisions which do not suit the Americans, that those companies would just walk away?
Yes, it could be as possible. But I would like to say something here. The GE electric giant American company, they already signed, in 30th of April, according to the Reuters report, they already signed a roadmap agreement with the Iraqi government. And this is included in the contract. The contract is around around $14 billion. So therefore, there is a contract. And also German Siemens company, also electric energy transnational corporation, also signed a roadmap contract. But part of those contracts, they have been implemented, not all of them. However, the United States put pressure to integrate or implement the entire roadmap or even more contracts in the future. So therefore, Iraq has already been involved. Those giant companies, they are already being involved in the Iraqi electric infrastructure. And I would like to mention something. The Minister of Electricity in Iraq, he studied in the UK and he worked for more than decades in the United States, including the Brookings Institute. So therefore, the Minister of Electricity, he has a great connection with the United States energy companies, I assume. because he was.
But then Zana, I can contrast that with what happened in Iran, can't I? Because a lot of European companies, for example, came into Iran after the nuclear deal was signed, and most of them, or all of them at least, to the best of my knowledge, have now walked away, be it the Italians, be it the French Total, or otherwise. What's to say that if tomorrow Iraq were to tell the Americans we are not going to make an enemy, for example, out of Iran, that the Americans would not retaliate?
It is very much possible. I assume even if they have security instability or any political problems, those companies would leave. This is very logical consequence for the companies. As you know, you have many energy companies, oil transnational energy companies in the southern Iraq. Some of their staff left because of the rocket bombardment last week. Therefore, if you have any instability or insecurity, or even if the relationship worsened between Iraq and the United States, there is high potential for those companies to leave Iraq. There is a chance for them to leave.
Okay, so Cyril, I'll give you the final word, Cyril. We have a few minutes left. What are your thoughts about, the way that the U.S. does conduct, its energy politics worldwide? Again, when it comes to the example of Iraq and Venezuela, it just seems like whenever it doesn't get its way, it either lobbies and pressures the government into doing what it wants, and or it just wants their energy supplies or exports to be completely zeroed and tries to destroy their economy to an extent that it can. Is that healthy even for U.S. interests?
It's simple. It's not going to help them. It's not working either. Okay. And if it's on Iraq, I do not expect the U.S. even to be able to put on sanctions on Iraq, because even the Saudis and the UAE will not be helping them then. It's Iraq is another issue than Iran. In Iraq, we have U.S. soldiers, we have U.S. companies, we have U.S. interests. Yeah. They do understand that Iraq is another issue than Iran or Venezuela. And are they acting in a functional way what the U.S. at this moment is doing? On a geopolitical issue, maybe it is. Yeah. On a U.S. economical interest, it's not the right way to act.
Cyril, I just wanted to, just something came to my mind to ask you this very quickly if you can. Do you think that in some ways that high oil prices would actually benefit many U.S. energy companies and even U.S. industry itself?
How strange it sounds, but for U.S. shale, it will help. For U.S. industry, it could even help, because then clients elsewhere will have more cash. I do not expect that Trump is looking at it this way, because he's afraid that if gasoline prices will be high, that he will not be re-elected anymore.
Okay, we'll leave it there at that, but of course that's a pertinent point to end. I'll thank Cyril and Zana for their time and their insight, of course. And as Cyril there mentioned at the end, there are a lot of political considerations to take into account when it comes to how Donald Trump and the U.S. administration, the U.S. establishment has acted when it comes to its energy politics worldwide, although it's undeniable that the U.S. uses energy as a political tool, pressuring Venezuela and Iran to do as it wishes, obviously unsuccessfully so far at least, and then pressuring Iraq to essentially, and many people would argue, get its way, to get those hefty contracts, 14 billion, as Zana there said. That is no joke. But would the U.S. walk away from those contracts if Iraq, for example, were to not play ball with its geopolitical ambitions in the region, its continuing Iranian pressure, maximum pressure campaign. Iraq has already said it does not want to be the site of any invasions or pressure on Iran. It is a neighbor, after all. We'll keep a very close eye on how all that develops going further and whether this is, as Cyril said, not in U.S. interests. And that, of course, can be argued as well. I'll be back after a short break with our next segment. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of the show, we're going to discuss the MH17 investigation. As you know, Dutch investigators have announced the arrest warrants for 4 suspects, 3 Russians, most of them with military backgrounds, and 1 Ukrainian. Their charges are not specifically for firing the missile at the MH17, as the investigators claim occurred. And this, of course, in 2014 over Russian-controlled territory, essentially, in East Ukraine, but are saying that they are responsible for causing the crash of Malaysian Airlines flight 17, I should say, which killed 298 people, the vast majority of those Dutch citizens. Let's discuss this a bit further, because obviously the Russians have denied this. Vladimir Putin quite clearly coming out and saying that this investigation was biased from the get-go. And Mahathir Mohamad, mind you, even the Malaysian leader, has also said that this has been a biased investigation. Our guests joining us to discuss this further are Pavel Luzin, who is a PhD in international relations and an expert in Russia's foreign policy and defense. He's joining us now from Perm in Russia. We're also joined by Emanuel, Pietrobon, who is a political analyst. He's joining us now from St. Petersburg in Russia. And we're also joined then by Dimosthenis Dimopoulos, who is a geopolitical analyst and researcher at the Institute of International Relations. He's joining us now from Athens in Greece. Dimosthenis, Emanuel, and Pavel, thank you all for joining us. Pavel, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the MH17 investigation and the accusation, essentially, that Russia is behind this?
Russia is behind this, but criminal investigation team doesn't have a mandate to accuse military personnel or politicians. That's why investigation team charged only formerly civil people like Girkin, like Borodai, and 2 other guys.
So are you saying, Pavel, that Russia ordered for the plane to be attacked?
No. Russia ordered that Buk should come to Ukraine and should attack Ukrainian military aircrafts, planes and helicopters. But I think that the attack of MH17 was just a kind of emergency situation, both for this plane and for that people who attacked this plane. They definitely didn't want to do this, okay. But currently they don't want to take responsibility for this.
Okay, Dimosthenis, I wonder what your thoughts are about that. I think that this was a mistake.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And that's the case if you, let's say, theoretically we have the Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the correct one. Either the Ukrainians did something spectacular, which I doubt they have the knowledge and the capabilities to do, and managed to frame the Russians so perfectly, or simply the Russians did it. And the only logical explanation, as Clausewitz says, it's that in war there's friction, mistakes happen, nothing goes as planned, And it's obvious that with a very old weapon system as the Buk 1, the M1 system is quite old platform from the 70s, the Soviet era anyway, and probably the crew that was operating it wasn't very well trained, or it wouldn't be possible for them to identify that this plane with these old radars the system has, that this plane was actually a civilian plane and not, let's say, an Antonov 26 that was transporting supplies and airdropping them, as it was being done at that time from the Ukrainians. So definitely that was a mistake. The Russians or the separatists had no reason to shoot down a civilian plane. They would gain nothing from it.
Emanuel, I wonder what your thoughts are about that, because Emanuel, I imagine some in Russia, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, would think that, listen, the Ukrainians could very well want to frame Russia, wouldn't they?
Yes, in Russia there is another version, of course, and according to Russia, it was a kind of false flag operation made by Ukrainians to exacerbate the situation against Russia. And I would like to focus on one point, that not even the Malaysia Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, believes in the mainstream version. And I'm telling you what he told the reporters yesterday.
Yeah.
We are very unhappy because from the very beginning it became a political issue on how to accuse Russia of the wrongdoing. Even before they examine the proofs, the evidence, they already say Russia. So it is very difficult for us to accept that. And I think his words are emblematic because they tell us something. There may be something else, may be hidden and covered up in this story.
Do you not think, though, Emanuel, that it's possible that Mahathir Mohamad, as what he said, under pressure of sorts, because there are some important contracts, aren't there, between Malaysia and Russia? Do you think that in some ways Mahathir Mohamad was pressured by that?
Everything could be, yes, everything. It could be, in this case, pragmatism and realism behind his speech.
Okay.
But since the very beginning of the incident, this was the position of Malaysia. Since the very beginning.
Okay, so Pavel, I wanted to get your thoughts on that because you're also in Russia. What is your opinion on if this was, as Russia would claim, a false flag operation, that this was Ukraine which wanted to frame it?
So, let's remember that days. Pro-Russian separatists with support of, definitely with support of Russian military intelligence, they tried to capture all the areas of Donetsk Oblast and Lugansk Oblast. And Ukraine army used combat aviation against them. And they needed some support, some surface-to-air missiles to deal with this combat aviation. They asked, definitely, I have no doubts about the conclusions of criminal investigation team, joint investigation team. They asked Russia to provide them with this support, with these surface-to-air missiles. Russia ordered this book from Kursk 53rd Brigade, ordered this book to move directly to Ukraine and to defend these separatists, of course.
So, Pavel, what you're describing right now, why doesn't Russia admit that, at least? Why doesn't Russia admit that these people needed support, and that is why the Buk missile was transferred to them?
It's a simple question, because Ukraine combat aviation, of course, it was a quite weak combat aviation, but nevertheless, this aviation damaged separatists' heart. And this aviation allowed Ukraine army to struggle against separatists, to bring the separatists back to Russian borders. And that's why Russia decided to provide separatists with this surface-to-air missile, because Russia wanted to establish Novorossiya, if you remember, that spring and that summer. Novorossiya from Donetsk, from Kharkiv, from Dnipro to Odessa.
Yeah.
And Russia wanted to get a ground corridor with Crimea. with
Okay,
annexed
so
Crimea.
let me go to Dimosthenis. Dimosthenis, what is about that? Why doesn't Russia just say, listen, Ukraine kept attacking these people, and these people needed some form of defense, so we gave them a Buk missile. Now, what happened in the heat of war may have been a mistake, etc. But why doesn't Russia at least admit that first part, saying that these people needed to be defended, if that is the truth?
Well, definitely it is the truth, but I don't think they have to gain anything from that, because admitting that would, even more reinforce the point that the investigation thing is making, and they have no reason to do that anyway. They're not going to gain anything from it. Even if they do, they don't, let's say, be treated better. I won't say that.
To be fair, Dimosthenis, it looks kind of silly, doesn't it, on Russia to say that we're not involved at all, that we're not involved in the separatist movement at all, that this is the people themselves independently doing all of this. That looks kind of silly as well, doesn't it?
Well, most policies do look silly, if you look at them from the outside. But still, it doesn't change anything. That's the policy. They have to stick to it. If you create a narrative that, let's say, we are not involved in that, that's a people movement, that the people revolted against their government, and we are not. They're doing it by themselves. They have made and built on that narrative. They are not gaining anything from changing that now, 5 years later. It's everybody does the same. You build a narrative and you keep supporting it no matter what, unless someone can prove you that you're wrong. And at the moment, nobody can prove that they're doing it. We know that they're doing it. They probably have the right to do it, let's say, but that's another totally different discussion. But nobody can, prove it. It's simple as that. So they don't have any reason. They won't gain anything from that. It's simple as that. In politics,
Okay.
It's whether you gain something or you don't.
Okay, so Emanuel, I wonder where your thought on that then, because I still have a hard time understanding that, listen, if Russia were to just admit that these people needed defense, so that would not necessarily mean that it's guilty for this specific attack, but would just contextualize the situation in that region. Do you think that Russia should do that, or do you agree with the other two guests?
I personally agree with the other speaker, and because Russia has always denied any involvement in the support of the Donbas rebels. So it is in the interest of Russia to deny any responsibility, even behind the provision of the Buk missiles to the rebels. And but one interesting thing is that not only the rebels have this weapon, also the Ukrainian army employs the Buk missiles. And soon after the crash, the Russian Ministry of Defense told in a press conference that Russia had satellite photos showing the Ukrainian army moving a Buk battery to the area close to the territory controlled by the rebels, some hours before the crash. And this installation was then moved away again the day after. And but these information are not spread worldwide. They are restricted in Russia. So the Russian version is not as mainstream as the Western version is,
Okay.
And this is why we usually believe to the Western version, but we should focus also on the evidence provided by the Russian.
All right, let's now add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Jerry Skinner, who is the principal attorney in the European Commission of Human Rights action, which is being pursued in respect to the loss of flight MH17. He's joining us now from Romania. Jerry, we appreciate your time today. Jerry, in the investigation that you've been part of, what exactly have you found vis-a-vis responsibility on the part of Russia? The other guests we've spoken to in this segment have said that the Russians would not have wanted to bring down an airliner, though they may have very well supplied this Buk missile to these separatists. Is that, do you think, that the correct narrative?
No, we don't agree with that. We believe it was a deliberate act. It is consistent with a history of deliberate acts when Russia was interested in pursuing foreign policies that involved its former satellite countries. It happened with the Chechens and the apartment bombings. It happened with the Chechens again with the terrorists that took control of the Moscow theater. And finally, it happened with the opportunity that was presented by the terrorists who took over the Beslan school. And they responded in each one of those cases with inappropriate military force and then blamed it on the terrorists and their nation states. And we believe, based on the policies that were being pursued at the time between the Ukraine and Russia, that this act was meant as a provocation to justify the invasion of the eastern Ukraine by the regular Russian military. And we believe that the Buk missile was parked, essentially, in a position where it only had one type of target that it could hit.
Okay.
And that's what they did.
But do you not think it's quite possible, Jerry, that these separatists or whoever fired this Buk missile thought that what they were firing at was a Ukrainian military jet? Because from what I've understood, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, is that the Buk missile, at least the one that was supplied to these separatists, was not a very advanced one. It does not have the most advanced technology and radars.
Well, that's an interesting observation. I have visited an identical exemplar Buk Tilar in Finland, and it is one of those things in the military where at Kursk they had 3 battalions in the 53rd Brigade, and they had a variety of models of equipment, and the one that was sent out was essentially current in the operative military. It had sufficient radar. It also had a camera system which could not only provide you with a visual image, but could provide you with an infrared image. And it would be very easy to distinguish the 2 large fan jet engines of commercial aircraft from any kind of military aircraft.
All right, Jerry, we'll leave it there at that. Of course, we appreciate you putting that important context forward for us. That was Jerry Skinner speaking to us from Romania, as I said, principal attorney in the European Commission of Human Rights action being pursued in respect to the loss of flight MH17 and the ongoing investigation into that tragedy. Our other guests, of course, disagreed with Jerry's take there, saying that this may have very well been either Ukraine framing Russia, or B, the separatists mistakenly having shot at this airliner, thinking that it may have been a Ukrainian military jet. Of course, 2 polar opposite takes on this, and we wanted to bring both of those to you. We'll keep a close eye on how this investigation develops going forward and how the case develops as well here in Scope. But I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.